Okay, so this week we are going to be talking about selecting and evaluating sources, and part of that is related to the shift from print to electronic. So, the first thing I just wanted to mention is that, as we all know, there is a proliferation of web products, and this can make it more difficult to figure out what products to purchase. So we've got journals, which are available through databases, and we've also got open source journals. There are ebooks, in particular in relation to reference, books like dictionaries and encyclopedias. And with so many free web dictionaries, do you really need to purchase any? There are aggregators of products, so that's publishers and vendors who offer platforms to access multiple resources such as databases. And these are some of the big vendors, aggregators, or publishers at the bottom of the slide, names that if you're not already familiar with, you will become familiar with. EBSCO, ProQuest, ScienceDirect, Gale, Ovid, LexisNexis, and Factiva are only a few, and there are also smaller databases that may not be affiliated with these aggregators. So, what are some of the issues in reference collection? What does your library need? What do your patrons need or want? Do you have a collection development policy for your reference collection? What are your weeding policies? What's outdated? How often are resources used? What is the physical condition of the resources, especially if they are hard copies? And these are all important questions that you need to think about. And then within all of these questions are more questions. So, some things to consider when you're evaluating resources are format, which you want to think about. Do you want particular resources in print, or do you want them electronically, or do you want them both? What are the costs? Something to bear in mind is that with a print edition, you own it forever, but with an electronic version, you buy access, which can vary between limited use, where only a certain amount of people can use it at a given time, or unlimited access. Also, is your library buying in a consortium with other libraries, which can reduce your costs? And if not, would your library consider being in a consortium? And then what kind of training will staff need to be able to use and provide these resources? And what kind of equipment will you need? How many computers? How will they be maintained? And then under scope, you'll want to know, what does the resource cover? What is its range of topics? What's the time period it covers? If it's a database, what is the size and what are the sources it gives access to? And how does the database compare with others? Is there a lot of overlap? Sometimes it's difficult to separate the large vendors and get a particular mix of resources because a lot of them come as a package deal. And so then you really need to assess what you need. Do you need two databases that have an overlap of about half their resources? And then what about the half that don't overlap? How do you account for all of this? Another thing to think about is relation to similar works. How different is the new edition of a resource from the previous one? Are the changes significant or are they minor? So, again, there's the overlap issue. Who is the resource addressing? Is the language appropriate for the audience? How does a digital copy compare with a print copy? When you're thinking about authority, you want to find out or ask the reputation of the editors and writers. What's their expertise and what is their education, and how reputable is the publisher. Next, you want to think about treatment, which refers to, are the facts reliable? How do you know if they're reliable? Are there things missing? One way to do this is to compare some of the content with other similar works. You'll also need to look up some of the facts to get an idea of how reliable and complete they are. Things to look at which seem simple but may tell you a lot are the words spelled correctly. This can give you a clue about the editing. Is the writing consistent with who the audience is supposed to be? Another thing you want to look at is arrangement. Is it alphabetical, chronological, or classified? Is it easy to figure out what's going on and how to find things? Is the organization appropriate for the audience? Are there indexes? Are there cross references? And are they all usable, user friendly, and easily navigable? So let's talk about virtual reference. And again, you need to weigh whether free resources are enough or if you need to buy any subscription resources. So, for example, the Library of Congress offers a number of virtual reference sources. Or if you are looking for reviews of sources, do you go to Books in Print, which is subscription, or do you go to Amazon? What are you comfortable with? And then just before we go on, I wanted to just quickly show you some of what's available through the Library of Congress. There are things like almanacs, encyclopedias, dictionaries, maps. Everything is worth exploring as a way to make decisions. So let's think about vendors. Does the vendor provide responsive customer service and technical support that is available during library working hours? What is the availability and quality of training programs? What is the vendor's reputation and business record, and how do those suggest continued support for the product through updates or new versions? And is their documentation thorough and clear? And then another thing you will want to do is know how to evaluate and research how much something is being used. So some of that includes, if you're talking about books, placing something on a book that will be disturbed when it's used, like a piece of paper on top of it, um, recording reshelving times, how many times is something reshelved. Of course, you can talk to your users. You might want to conduct surveys or interviews. You might want to observe. You also will want to talk to librarians. And then with electronic resources, there are ways to track what's being used, like counters, but you'll still want to understand how they're being used. So that would again require thinking about talking to people. And so I also want to talk about Library 2.0 and Web 3.0. And I thought this was just kind of a nice picture showing all the possibilities that are out there. So Library 2.0 probably began about 10 to 12 years ago when libraries started being more interactive and social as the web became more interactive and social. And one of the ways it's been explained is that it invites user participation in the creation of the virtual services they want, supported by consistent evaluation of those services. And it also attempts to reach new users and better serve current ones through improved customer driven offerings. There's a blog that's called The Shifted Librarian, and in it she writes about Library 2.0. It's to serve as many of your users as possible. You have to be in as many of the places where they are as possible. And that means being out in your community physically and digitally. And also, most of the topics for the Tech Talks are directly related to Library 2.0 and Web 3.0 services. And even the subject guides you're doing are related to this, communicating with the public, having online tools that help patrons navigate the library system. So, libraries and Web 3.0 are really extensions of interactive services, often referred to as intelligent libraries that create cultures of participation. And one definition would be libraries using technologies such as the semantic web, cloud computing, mobile devices, as well as a re envisioning of our use of established technologies such as federated search to facilitate user generated content and collaboration to promote and make library collections accessible. Library 3.0 library services are frequently updated and evaluated to meet the emerging needs of library users. So, in one sense, these technologies can be thought of as new things, and for other people, um, and for some people, they are, but they're really not at this point. In reality, they're a natural technological extension of the services that libraries have always had. But libraries are still figuring out how to integrate all of these technologies, and there is a lot to think about. So, what might be some of the issues in terms of evaluating interactive resources and services? It's very possible that some library staff just will not be familiar with using some of these technologies, especially if they're older. And it really doesn't matter whether they're blogs or RSS feeds, podcasts, or whatever, um, there can be some resistance. So it's important not to put your staff into upheaval. There really needs to be good training for staff. And one of the really important aspects of implementing new resources is to maintain stability within the library, which means don't be changing things around quickly. And even if staff is familiar, and of course, we would expect that younger staff would be with these resources, they might not be quite as familiar as the best ways to use them. So, whatever you implement, you want to see how it works, how the staff adjusts to using any new technologies. The other thing is that you also have to make sure that you have enough staff to maintain whatever you implement. So, if you are blogging, who's going to be doing the blogging? If you have a Facebook page, who is doing it? What are the parameters of what they're allowed to post? And what kinds of things will you be posting? So, these are all considerations. And also, how are your users adjusting to these resources? How are they using them? And how are they altering the flow of reference? And then this also comes back to just knowing your user. What will work for them? You shouldn't implement tech just because it's a cool thing to do. You want to make sure that this is something your users will be interested in. If your population is mainly elderly, the chances of them using Facebook could be much smaller than it would be if you had a younger crowd. So, not only should you give staff training on these tools, but you should also think about offering training to your users. And then, just because it can be done doesn't mean it should be done. You should always evaluate, how is the product holding up? Is it working for staff? Is it working for users? And should you continue? Maintaining these resources does take a lot of effort.